We saw that patients who got chemotherapy just before we disrupted the blood-brain barrier tended to do better, but we did see quite a few patients, do well and have some evidence, we think, of tumor control.
Welcome to Curing with Sound, a podcast presented by the Focus Ultrasound Foundation. I'm your host, Allison Preston Smith. Glioblastoma, or GBM, is the most common and one of the most aggressive types of brain cancer. Despite advances in treatment, outcomes for patients with recurrent GBM remain poor, with an average survival rate of less than 1 year. One of the major challenges is the blood-brain barrier, a protective shield that keeps harmful substances and toxins out of the brain, but it also prevents potentially life-saving drugs from getting in. Carthera, a clinical stage medical device company, is tackling this challenge with the SonoCloud 9, an implantable ultrasound device designed to temporarily open the blood-brain barrier and enhance drug delivery. Earlier this year, Carthera launched SONOBIRD, a pivotal phase 3 clinical trial in the United States and Europe. This study will compare SonoCloud 9 plus chemotherapy to standard of care treatments for recurrent glioblastoma. We're joined by Dr. Michael Canney, Chief Scientific Officer at Carthera, to learn more about the SONOBIRD trial and the innovative SonoCloud 9 device. Welcome to the podcast, Michael.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on today.
Can you first tell us what is glioblastoma and what do patients experience?
Yeah, so glioblastoma is the most aggressive and common primary malignant brain tumor in adults. It affects about 3 in 100,000 people. And once you get glioblastoma, right now the prognosis is pretty poor. Patients typically have an overall survival around 1 year, 2 years is what's seen in these patients.
Why is it so difficult to treat?
So one of the reasons why it's so difficult to treat is because of the blood-brain barrier. So the blood-brain barrier restricts how therapeutics get into the brain, and most therapeutics don't actually cross the blood-brain barrier. And because of this reason, there's not a lot of effective therapies for glioblastoma. Right now, there's one drug that's typically used that was approved some time ago, but there's not a lot of other effective therapies for this disease.
Can you explain the meaning behind the name of the trial, SONOBIRD, and provide an overview of the clinical trial?
Sure. So SONOBIRD was an acronym kind of we came up with from the trial. The trial is a phase 3 pivotal trial treating patients with first recurrence of glioblastoma. And in this trial, we're actually randomizing patients to get either our SonoCloud 9 system in combination with carboplatin chemotherapy or standard of care treatment.
How many participants are you hoping enroll?
We are hoping to enroll 560 patients that will be randomized into these two arms.
And then are there any exclusions to who can enroll?
Yeah, so some of the main considerations for patients is that they have to be eligible for an additional surgical resection. Not all patients are always eligible for surgical resection. They have to be able to remove at least half of the enhancing area that's left to be eligible for resection. They also have to have a maximum tumor diameter that's less than 5 centimeters. So our device has a certain dimension. It's just over 5 centimeters. And so we try to make sure that we can really cover the zone of tissue that we want to cover in these patients.
And are the participants that you enroll, are they from the U.S. only, or is this across multiple countries?
So it's across a lot of different countries. We currently have sites in the United States and we have sites in Europe. Quite a few countries are covered right now in Europe. We have Spain, Italy, France, the Netherlands, Denmark, Germany, I'm going to forget one here, Sweden. But we generally have most of the countries in Western Europe are covered with sites on this trial.
And are you still enrolling?
We are still enrolling, yeah. So enrollment is going really well, but we plan to continue enrolling until we've finished recruitment, which should be, take a little bit more time.
That's great. So is this the largest clinical trial that Carthera has conducted?
Yes, it is. So previous to this, we've conducted several phase 1, 2 trials testing out this technique of disrupting the blood-brain barrier using ultrasound. We had a first generation of the system called the SONOCLOUD 1 that we originally tested in patients only in France in a clinical trial. That started in 2014. And after that, we've run several phase 2 trials, let's say, testing this new SONOCLOUD 9 system that has a larger footprint, can cover a much larger brain region for delivering chemotherapy. And these trials have gone well, and so now we're launching this phase 3 trial, hopefully to seek regulatory approval for our system.
As part of this clinical trial, you're using focus ultrasound to open the blood-brain barrier before delivering chemotherapy. Why is it so important to open the blood-brain barrier first?
So it's really important, as we mentioned, I think before, the blood-brain barrier really restricts drugs crossing into the brain. So you typically, drugs that are larger than 500 Daltons, which kind of excludes any kind of larger molecule or antibody type drug, just don't cross over the blood-brain barrier. And so if you take a drug, we could talk about antibodies, for example. They say, 0.1% or something is the number of drug that crosses. And so the question is, if you get so little drug across, is the drug actually going to have a therapeutic effect? And in our case, for carboplatin is the drug we're using. It is a pretty small molecule, but it still doesn't really cross the blood-brain barrier. And we know through all of our work, preclinical work and clinical work, that when we disrupt the blood-brain barrier, we can increase that concentration of drug significantly. And so here we've seen, even in patients, we published in, several years ago with Dr. Adam Sonoben, we showed that we could increase drug concentrations with carboplatin by 5 to 7-fold. So a pretty significant increase in drug.
So you have this SONOCLOUD 9 device. Can you walk us through how that gets implanted?
Yeah, so the surgical procedure is pretty much follows how you would do a resection procedure. So when patients go in to get a resection or debulking procedure, they basically go in and they try to remove whatever was enhancing, whatever's cancerous. Typically, they use neuronavigation. They'll look at the T1 enhancement on an MRI image. They'll try to remove as much as they can of the, cancerous tumor cells without imposing a functional deficit on the patient. That's generally the goal for the neurosurgeon. And our SONOCLOUD 9 is really designed to fit into that surgical practice. So when a surgeon goes in, they will remove the bone flap, they'll place the SONOCLOUD 9, screw it into the bone, and that SONOCLOUD 9 just replaces the bone flap. And so it really adds on very little time to the surgical procedure. And so it's really designed to fit into, routine standard of care, how they would do surgery anyways.
And once it's implanted, how long does it stay there?
So right now it stays for the whole treatment cycle. So on our clinical trials right now, we're typically treating patients for about 6 months. And it can stay longer than that. We know we have patients who have kept it for several years. Generally, they aren't really bothered by the implant. They'll typically only remove it in case there's issues in the patient, or if the patient wants it removed, then they will go ahead and remove it. But generally, most patients, keep it in even after the trials are over.
So they have this device, and then what happens when they get their chemotherapy treatments?
Yeah, so the chemotherapy treatments also are very similar to how a patient would experience standard of care. So a patient comes in, when they get chemotherapy, they typically go to the infusion suite. They'll get labs drawn, they'll get some, pre-medication drugs, and then they'll get their chemotherapy. And so here we'll infuse chemotherapy on our pivotal trial right now over 30 minutes. At the end of that 30-minute infusion of drug, we connect up the device, and so there's a small port basically on the device that connects to a needle that plugs into the device, and that provides all the power for the device. And then we'll turn on the device for 4.5 minutes, and that disrupts the blood-brain barrier. And at the end of that procedure, the patient is basically done with the treatment. So 4.5 minutes is basically added on to the time they would be in the infusion suite anyways.
And are there any potential side effects or anything that patients can expect afterwards?
Yeah, so we see, some transient neurological effects we've published. We'll see, I think, because we're disrupting the blood-brain barrier, there are some effects we see. So we'll see, patients will have a headache. They may have blurred vision depending on how the implant is placed. They may have some issues with speech. We've seen a lot of these different effects, which has been kind of interesting to document how the blood-brain barrier may, whether it's due to the blood-brain barrier disruption or due to some other neuromodulation, is still up for debate. But we know that ultrasound can have these properties on the brain, and these typically resolve pretty quickly. And so we've measured how long the blood-brain barrier stays open on our trials, and we typically see that it's closing within an hour or so. And that's kind of the time course when we typically see most of these effects resolve by.
Mm-hmm. And I know it's too early to talk about any kind of results, but is there anything you can mention about, positive results coming from this kind of treatment?
Yeah, so the only thing I can mention here is our phase 2 results. We did publish last year in Nature Communications. So these results were a way for us, one, to show the safety of the system, that we could safely disrupt the blood-brain barrier over a very large region using the SonoCloud 9. And we also did something else, which is we kind of varied when we gave the chemotherapy relative to the blood-brain barrier disruption procedure. So that gave us two different cohorts we could compare. We saw that patients who got chemotherapy just before we disrupted the blood-brain barrier tended to do better. Again, we had very small cohorts, but it was just an observation in that study. But we did see quite a few patients, do well and have some evidence, we think, of tumor control. Those are all in our phase 2 publication.
How is the SonoCloud device similar and different to other types of focus ultrasound devices that are used to open the blood-brain barrier?
Yeah, so I think it's fundamentally very, very different. So one, it's an implant. So we know that, the transcranial focused ultrasound devices out there are non-invasive, so there's no implantation procedure. But they're very different in terms of how they get inserted into the clinical workflow. And so I talked before about the implantation and the sonication procedure. For our system, a neurosurgeon goes in and does a resection the way they would normally do a resection, thinks a little bit about where they're going to put the device, but generally doesn't affect the resection procedure very much, doesn't add a lot of time for that procedure. For the sonication procedure, it's almost the same thing. So a patient comes in, gets their chemotherapy, and has 4.5 minutes extra to disrupt the blood-brain barrier, get more drug in. Again, it's not a lot of burden for the sites. The sonication procedure, a lot of our sites, it's done by a nurse, actually. I think for focused ultrasound devices right now, there's still quite a change in standard of care. It's a new system. I think there's only certain specialized centers that can, use it. And I think that to disrupt this much volume of the blood-brain barrier, we're disrupting a very large volume over about a 6 by 6 by 6 centimeter region. Takes quite a bit of time with all the focused ultrasound systems that currently exist. So these are procedures that may last for hours. So if you're doing this very repeatedly, like we are, we're doing this every 3 weeks for patients. And so if you're taking a surgeon to do a procedure when they get chemotherapy that lasts, 2, 3, 4 hours, that could use up a lot of, hospital resources that are already a little bit scarce. So I think that's one of the big differentiators that we have between our technologies.
How do you explain to participants what focus ultrasound is and how it's being used in the trial?
So they should know, we generally have clinical sites all over the US and Europe, we mentioned. Patients definitely can get in touch with the PIs at those sites if they're interested. So patients can seek out clinical trials outside of their main hospital. They can participate and learn more about how they can do that. And so we have more information on our different clinical sites that are available at sonobird.eu. Has all the clinical sites that are enrolling right now in the trial, and patients can learn more there.
And just switching gears to talk more about focus ultrasound technology, what excites you about focus ultrasound?
It's a great question. I'm still working in focused ultrasound. So I got my PhD working in this field almost, started that 20 years ago, and still here working in the field. And I think there's a lot of great work that's been done by the FUS Foundation to raise awareness and kind of build, the number of indications is just booming, I think, across the field. But I think we're still kind of at the beginning, people still aren't really aware of it. It's still something that's new. And so, I think it's exciting. I think we're seeing more and more applications. I think applications like this with drug delivery, there still aren't any approved applications that I can think of that are actually using ultrasound for drug delivery. We're still looking for, a clinical success before we can implement this kind of technology. And I'm hoping that this trial will bring us there.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Michael, for sharing with us about this clinical trial. We are definitely excited to keep up with it and hope the results are positive.
Yeah. Thank you so much again for having me on today.
This episode of Curing with Sound has been presented by the Focus Ultrasound Foundation. If you'd like to learn more about Focus Ultrasound or the foundation, visit our website at fusfoundation.org. You can also sign up for our newsletter and follow us on social media. Be sure to subscribe to the Curing with Sound podcast so you don't miss the latest information about Focus Ultrasound. You can also rate and review the show.